decided to challenge this play. He has tossed down the red flag.
Don't forget they have to have good reason to overturn the official's decision.
After review of the play, the ruling on the field stands as called and a touchdown.
Hey, welcome to our After Further Review series. This is part 2 of talking about this verse, 1 Timothy 2, verse 15, about women being saved through childbearing. We had to do 2 parts because last week I only had time to really cover the context and the overarching themes of 1 Timothy that are going to help us, give us clues in interpreting what this verse 15 is talking about. I'm trying a new setup here. I've got lights, everywhere in my office. So sorry about the glare in my glasses. The other disclaimer is that this is probably going to be the most nerdy, geeky, dorky class that we have had so far. We're going to get pretty deep into the Greek here and talk about really the challenge of interpreting the meaning that Paul may have been talking about in this verse. So get ready for that. Let's just talk about real quick the different ways that this passage has been translated into a number of different English versions. Some of them are very similar, and 2 or 3 of them take a pretty different translation route for some of these words. And we're going to talk about why. But NIV, but women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. These last 4 nouns, faith, love, holiness, and propriety, are for the most part the same throughout most of the translations. Some of them will say modesty or self-control, but faith, love, and holiness, usually the same in all of them. The New Revised Standard Version says, yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith, love, and holiness. Common English Bible, but a wife will be brought safely through childbirth if they both continue in faith, love, and holiness together with self-control. English Standard Version is going to say, yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, holiness, self-control. New King James, nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing, pretty similar. New American Standard, but women will be preserved through childbirth if they continue in those things. And then the Young's Living Translation, the Young's Literal Translation says, and she shall be saved through the childbearing if they remain in faith, love, and sanctification with sobriety. Now, some of those you might have saw were pretty different, and they can have a pretty different trajectory as far as how you interpret the meaning of those words and those phrases things. So we're going to jump in here. This is the Greek of this verse. I checked through all of the different Koine Greek compilation Bibles that we have today. This verse is basically exactly the same in all of them. It's not like translators are working on different manuscripts to come up with different interpretations and different translations. This is essentially what they all had. The only difference is like this little iota mark here. A couple of them don't have, and a couple of them do. There's like 1 or 2 accents. In the end, it really doesn't cause a translation issue. They're all working off basically the same text, but we come away with fairly different interpretations of it. So let's just kind of jump in here. Let's talk about this first word. This is sophacetai, right? That is the verb that comes from the verb to save, sozo, and this sophacetai is the 3rd singular future passive indicative form. You might get a kick out of this, but let me just show you. There are in Greek a number of different tenses and forms, so many variations for a single verb. There's about 12 different categories that go into what creates the ending where you get third singular future passive indicative. So this is, when I was looking through all my Greek Bibles and my Greek notes and lexicons and all that, one of my college worksheets fell out. This is a single verb, okay? Let me just come around and I'll show you on the camera. This is the verb luo, okay? It's translated to loose, as in whatever is loosed on earth, I will loose in heaven. Just because it's an easy verb to go off of. That's 144 variations of a single word. And every single Greek verb is that way. You have to figure out because of the ending. So this comes from a 4-letter Greek word, sozo, which means I save. And so it gets really complicated, and there's a whole lot that you have to keep in mind to come away with the correct variation of that verb. But in this case, it's pretty easy to tell. It's third singular future passive indicative, which means she will be saved. All right. Now here's the thing. We can't be 100% certain whether Paul is talking about a spiritual saving or a physical saving. Sozo most commonly refers to physical safety in the Gospels and also in most of the other Greek writings that aren't in the Bible that we have available to us today. More often than not, it's translated in a physical sense than a spiritual sense. So that's why you're going to have some of those translations talk about being preserved through the process of childbirth. But so the most common meaning of the verb sozo is rescue, liberate, keep from harm, preserve from death, danger, possession, sin, or judgment. That would be any more of a spiritual sense. But yeah, so that is kind of the trouble in determining, is Paul talking about a physical saving here or a spiritual saving here? Is he talking about salvation, or is he talking about being rescued and kept from harm? So the problem with looking at this word, sophesetai, in a physical sense, which is, it's tempting for a few reasons to go that route. The hurdles with that I'm going to show you are that sozo refers to physical rescue in most of Greek, in the Gospels and Greek writing. However, Paul never uses it. In all of the writings that we have from Paul, from Romans to Philemon, is that he uses the verb sozo every time in a fairly obvious spiritual sense. So to suggest that Paul is using this word in a physical sense here, that women will be kept safe throughout the process of childbirth, have to get over that hurdle. This would be the only time where Paul ever uses sozo in a physical sense. Doesn't mean that it's impossible or that he couldn't have, but in every other case he doesn't. So it's tricky there. You not only have to struggle with that, but also the fact with, as we know, women throughout all of history are not always kept safe through childbirth, believer or non-believer, Christian or non-Christian. Both alike have died in the process of childbirth, thousands, maybe millions of times over throughout history. So there's trouble with looking at it that way. But here's another thing to consider. Is that we are talking about a church in Ephesus. Okay, we know that Paul is writing to Timothy in Ephesus from chapter 1. We talked about last week, or at least it's a strong clue or hint that he is. Now, Ephesus is the epicenter of the cult of Artemis that we also mentioned last week. But you remember in Acts chapter 19, when Paul and his companions are going around, they're converting several people from that cult to Christianity, and they're leaving that behind. And many in that city get really mad because essentially it started messing with their entire economy. They seize some of Paul's companions, take them into this big courtyard. They start trying to defend themselves, and all of the Ephesians start shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" They were very prideful of this religious cult that was there. So many women prayed and sacrificed to Artemis, not only in Ephesus, but elsewhere also. And she was the patron goddess, as you may know, of virgins and of young women from the time of puberty through their first childbirth. Okay? So many commentators suggest that Paul is basically saying, Artemis isn't going to save you. You don't need to pray to Artemis. You don't need to sacrifice to Artemis. You will be preserved. You will be safe. Don't worry. So that's maybe one point in the column of a physical sense here. But you do have to kind of make up your mind, and all of the interpretations kind of have to as well. Are we talking about a spiritual sense of the word sozo, or are we talking about a physical sense of the word sozo? I have to say that I started kind of on the physical side just because of the theological implications of it. But man, looking into more of the Greek, I'm a little bit more compelled to lean toward the spiritual sense of the word sozo that Paul is using here. Although that brings up another hurdle, okay? Day, that is the word but, which some of the translations include. It's not necessarily, you don't have to have it in the translation. Doesn't make a big difference, but some of them have it. Dia, that's the Greek word that is most often translated through. That's where we get the word diameter, right? The measurement through a circle, that comes from the Greek word dia. Now, there's some less common meanings that are similar to through, but one of them would be during or throughout. And so, as you see, some of the interpretations, some of the translations will say throughout childbirth, or during childbirth, or in the process of childbirth, whereas some of the translations will say through childbirth. It's because there's several different ways to translate this word as well. Most often it's through, okay? But there are some less common meanings to that as well. All right, let's talk about this right here. So she will be saved, but she will be saved through, or in the process of, or during, the technogonias, that is the noun, childbearing or childbirth, okay? There's some interesting things about this word here. Many throughout history saw it as a reference to Christ. Paul just referenced Genesis 3 and Eve and the fall of man and all of that in that context. And in that context, we get the prophecy about the seed, right? The offspring, where God is telling the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He will bruise your head and you will bruise his heel, right? You remember that from Genesis chapter 3. So the fact that this is a singular use of the verb, she will be saved, makes people think that we're talking about Mary or Eve. It's an interesting interpretation. One of the clues that people look to for that interpretation is the inclusion of taste right here. There's 26 different ways to render the definite article in Greek, the. So this says the childbirth. Taste is one of the ways that you say the. It's one of the feminine forms. But there's some hurdles that the proponents of that interpretation have to justify, and here's what those are. The first one is, how much sense does it make to make the jump from talking about women in Ephesus that 1 Timothy is working with? How much sense does it make to jump through Mary or from Eve into Mary? One of the points in that column, though, is that basically Paul just did it in referencing Genesis 3. Genesis 3 does it itself, references Christ in that passage. So, maybe it's not too far-fetched that's what it's talking about. But one of the other hurdles is that Mary was not saved by giving birth to Jesus. At least the Bible never implies that she's saved by giving birth to Jesus. That would really kind of depart from the theology of the New Testament. But the fact that the third hurdle, the fact that nowhere in Paul's writings is anyone saved specifically through the birth of Jesus. Paul always emphasizes the death of Jesus, right? That we are saved, we're given life through his death. Paul never says anywhere else or indicates that we're saved because of his birth. Now, you do need Jesus' birth, you do need the incarnation to make way for death and resurrection, right? So maybe that's where they get that from. But the text most naturally reads that salvation comes not as a result of giving birth, but most naturally the translation here is that through or in the process of giving birth. So just some tricky hurdles that you'd have to get over to make this talk about Jesus as some kind of prophecy. She will be saved through the birth of the child. So another popular theory is that Paul isn't necessarily using this word to talk about childbirth, but rather about child rearing or child raising. There's a hurdle with that interpretation, though. So technogonias, that is the word that we were just talking about, which Paul uses in that verse and also in chapter 5, verse 14, for the same thing, childbirth or childbearing. He uses a word in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 10, only 4 verses before 5, verse 14, where he uses this word again. Eteknotrothesin. Did I say that right? Eteknotrothesin. All right. That is a word that Paul uses for child rearing. Why would he use this word for child rearing? And then in this context, go back to this word for child birth or childbearing, if this word was interchangeable. Not saying that throughout all of Greek writings that it's not interchangeable, but Paul had this word available to him that obviously meant child raising here that he chose not to use here. So it's not very compelling to say that he meant child rearing or child raising when he uses that word here. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Let's go back to our verse here. Let's see, aeon, that means if or given or as long as. The most common translation is just to say if, all right? So most of the English translations are going to include that in there. This next word, menosine, that is the third person plural active subjunctive. That is they remain. So it's interesting that we've gone from singular, she will be saved, if they remain. That is one of the reasons that most interpreters, most translators will turn this into a plural, which is okay, usually, is because now he's using a plural verb down here. But this comes from meno, all right? That's I remain. So why switch from she, which is built into the verb, to they? It seems Paul has already done that in the context several times in just the past 5 or 6 verses. So he could have easily included the word all. Instead of only saying if they remain, he could have said if they all remain in a way to refer to all women through all time or all women in Ephesus. We don't know for sure which women he's talking about here. She will be saved if they all remain. Sorry, not all. He doesn't say all. Now, he could mean, or you could infer, all women through all time, but he doesn't say that. So you have to kind of guess, are we talking about, through the context, are we talking about wives? Are we talking about women there in Ephesus, or both? Or are we talking about women through all time, throughout all of history? Is he saying all women through all time, throughout history, will be saved through giving birth to a child, spiritually or physically? That would be difficult, because that would infer that unbelievers as well as believers will be saved. So I think the most likely interpretation of this is they being Christian women in generally, at least in Ephesus, and maybe throughout time as well. At least I think that seems to be an appropriate interpretation. Okay, let's go back. So, en, that's in. Piste, that is righteousness. Kai is and. Agape, that is love, as you probably know. And hagiasmo, or hagiasmoi, because there's a little iota at the end. That's holiness, okay? And then meta is with. Sothrosunes, and that is the word that is translated as good sense or modesty. Some of them will say sobriety. Several of them said self-control. They're all really kind of wrapped up in this word, sothrosunes. Okay, so I'm going to show my cards here. I think that, I personally prefer, for the easiest interpretation, to be that women will be kept physically safe or preserved throughout the process of childbirth. That's the most palatable for me to digest, given that he's writing to many Christians who just came out of Artemis worship, who probably were looking to Artemis to be saved through childbirth, looking to Artemis for deliverance. He just referenced Genesis 3, which is talking about the curse that would result because of the fall. And as you know, the curse for Eve was, in pain you shall bear childbirth, or I will multiply your pain and childbirth. That was one of the resultant results of the curse, right, of the fall. So perhaps this is a quick word of comfort from Paul to new Christians, as if to say, oh, by the way, speaking of Eve, which we just did in this whole curse thing, well, Jesus's work is sorting that all out, okay? Being a woman is no curse, right? In Christ, you are loved and meaningful and valuable, and I don't care what your culture or your society or any other culture or society says. You are valuable, cared for. God is going to keep you and guard you and protect you and preserve you. The difficulty with that, however, I admit, is that is not Paul's typical usage ever of the verb sozo. He always means it in a spiritual sense, okay? Nor would that interpretation really make sense of what we're talking about here with if they remain, or if they continue in righteousness and love and holiness with self-control. That wouldn't really connect these two phrases in this verse. If we set that whole meaning aside, okay, then what that would seem to leave us with a salvation by works, wouldn't it? If we're talking about spiritual salvation through childbirth, if they do this and this and this and this, that sounds like salvation by works, doesn't it? The problem with that would be obvious. Paul is very much against any kind of teaching of salvation by works, right? So why would it seem like, if it's not a physical thing that he's talking about up here, which obviously is going to have exceptions because women have died and haven't been kept safe, Christian and unchristian alike, So what is he talking about? Why would it seem like he implies a works-based salvation here? Two approaches I'm going to offer you. One, you can use the definite article back up here as the linchpin of the argument that Paul is actually talking about the childbearing, the childbirth of the child Jesus, which we are saved, which without that we couldn't have been saved through his death and resurrection, right? So then eternal salvation doesn't come to a woman through having a child, but because of the birth of Jesus. So that might take the edge off of what might sound like salvation by works. And then if we're talking about women who are already believers, saved by grace, then we know that righteousness, love, holiness, and self-control are not works, right? They're gifts given by God and signs of the salvation that a person has already been gifted, right? Think about Philippians 2, verse 12 that we talked about several weeks ago. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. It doesn't say work for your salvation. The interpretation, the translation that makes the most sense of that verse is work out of your salvation with fear and trembling. You have your salvation. Now you need to seriously consider how that looks like and how you're going to flesh that out in your actions, given your saved nature, right? It's God who imparts righteousness, right? It is God who gives us the ability and empowers us to love. It's through Jesus that we are made holy. And of course, it's the presence of God in our lives that gives us the ability to say no, that gives us self-control, right? I like this interpretation. The hurdle for it, however, is that you have to assume that including the definite article here and the fact that this is a singular she will be saved, you have to assume that that is definitely talking about the birth of Jesus. But like I already, via Eve and via Mary, which honestly would be a very obscure way for Paul to reference Jesus, okay, which isn't unheard of, but that's not typical of Paul really at all. The other hurdle to jump in that interpretation is that Paul always says the death of Jesus gives us life. He never says that the birth of Jesus gives us life or gives us salvation. So a couple of pretty serious hurdles in that interpretation. The other approach and the last interpretation that I'm going to leave you with is this. Okay, keep in mind that the whole reason Paul is writing to Timothy in Ephesus is to combat and safeguard the church, combat false teachers and safeguard the church from those false teachers. In Ephesus, you had false teachers infiltrating, perhaps by way of previously untaught women, which is why Paul commands that they be allowed to learn along with everyone else. And these false teachers, it seems, were convincing the women, and perhaps some of the men as well, to, one, forbid marriage and never get married, and also to forbid certain foods. And you can read 1 Timothy chapter 4, just a couple of chapters later, verses 1 through 5, and you kind of get the sense that's exactly what Paul is fighting against, these false teachers who are trying to forbid marriage and forbid certain foods. So, Paul mentioning childbirth here would essentially be a diss to these false teachers who are saying that they should not get married. Yes, there may still be pain in childbirth, but childbirth itself, Paul is insinuating, is absolutely not a curse in any sense of the word, and is in fact a God-given blessing that only women have the opportunity to experience and to participate in. Bearing children is by no means evil, and Paul is pretty serious about combating those false teachers who may have been suggesting that and who are also denigrating and devaluing marriage, saying don't get married. Perhaps in a way similar to the new Christians in Corinth who, according to a number of commentators, were most likely practicing some form of hermaphrodite living and saying that male and female no longer matter because Christ has come. After all, Genesis 3 says no male and female, which is going to be a pretty gross misinterpretation of that phrase that Paul uses. But that was something that they were latching onto, was male and female no longer matters. And of course, it doesn't matter as far as how close you are to God, of course. But it prompts Paul to tell them, it's both the Corinthians, and he tells Timothy to help enforce this in this church in Ephesus. It's true that males are no closer to God, right? We are all one in the Lord and a part of the same family, but your identity as male or as female certainly still matters and is important and is valuable to God. And he talks about head coverings and hair length in 1 Corinthians and all of that. So the last possible interpretation that Paul may be saying is essentially something like this. Men, you matter and you are important. Women, you matter and you are important. Men, don't act like the men of your culture. Be humble. And women, don't listen to the false teachers who are suggesting that your gender is less important or doesn't matter at all. After all, only women can bring about literal new life in the world. So let those around you see how blessed it is to live in Christ. So that's 3 interpretations. Take them or leave them, but just be honest about where the hurdles in each interpretation are. With whatever direction you go, certainly stay humble about it. Okay, I'm done with that. Next week, I want Jeff to tackle this. In Genesis chapter 1, it says, God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The word Elohim linguistically is plural, okay? How does that jive with, say, Deuteronomy 6, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one? How do we make sense of Elohim being linguistically in the plural form with the fact that the Jews were very strictly monotheistic? How did they understand that, and how should we understand that? Look forward to hearing that. We'll see you guys next week.